Every forum I go through this initial slide because it kind of sets up the models that ARC likes to use around asset lifecycle management. We think this is very old school, this approach to lifecycle management, because it doesn't truly represent the iterative nature of a plant. We separate it into 3 circles: design and build, hand over to operate and maintain, then there's some portfolio management to figure out the next project, and what gets funded goes into design and build again. In reality, we build a plant and we operate it for 50, 100 years, and during that 50 and 100 years, there's a bunch of upgrades or improvements that are made, and we feel very strong that this model better represents that iterative updating of the plant that occurs. Now, a lot of people in the audience, probably near everybody, is going to say, big deal, Ralph, this is intuitively obvious. It should be. The target audience for this model is not you. The target audience is when you have a conversation with somebody in management, particularly senior management, who may not be familiar with asset lifecycle management, or you bring in somebody from IT who knows IT real well, but not the business processes of asset lifecycle management. This will help you have a better conversation with them and better define what application integration makes sense and what doesn't, what business process optimization to do within each one of those circles and then between the circles. You remember the ExxonMobil presentation this morning. I think that is an example of verification in this model, because essentially what he was talking about is focusing in on the design and build business processes and optimizing them for faster time to benefit. So I'm going to bridge now to just talk a little bit about the Internet of Things. This slide, this happens to be Andy's favorite slide out of his presentation this morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the right-hand side and my interpretation of how the Internet of Things will affect maintenance. Initially, I'm going to, in this particular session, this slide, I'm going to focus on the maintenance function and field service. And this afternoon, I'm going to show the same slide, but I'm going to focus on inventory management and what happens to spare parts as a result of the Internet of Things. So, a lot of what's talked about is predictive maintenance, and I just want to go through, the as-is condition initially. The blue here is going to represent the viewpoint of the end user. So, service by the end user, by the OEM. So sometimes your equipment is, if you wanted your equipment serviced by an OEM, this is the kind of scenario that occurs. You normally then run it to failure. Usually there's cascading breakage, meaning some small component breaks. That cascades to a much bigger issue. Like if your engine runs out of oil, $25 of oil, you don't replace it right away, your engine seizes, and that turns into a $5,000 engine replacement. It leads to unplanned downtime, which is ugly from 2 viewpoints. Lost labor is obvious, but the greater impact becomes the work in process inventory that is lost. This is common in the continuous process industries and pharmaceutical. All that WIP gets lost, tremendous losses, and never mind what happens to sales and the value of the company. And typically in this scenario, you got 2-pass service going on, meaning they come once to inspect to see what the problem is, and then they come a second time with the right people in the inventory or the spare parts to fix it. So you could easily wind up with several days or a week worth of downtime. This, of course, is untenable. Nobody's going to do this. It is why we have maintenance departments today. All right, people have their own inventory and maintain their own equipment because they can't live with that kind of unplanned downtime. So with the Internet of Things, what's going to change? Turns into planned downtime. So the machine manufacturer can now do condition monitoring. I think it's safe to assume that the machine manufacturer knows their machine pretty well and understands its parameters and can predict failure. And as a result, now there is no more unplanned downtime, it's planned. So the machine manufacturer tells the end user that there's a problem, they schedule the maintenance, it's one pass, the machine manufacturer already knows what the problem is, show up with the spare parts. So we move to a situation where, and this is, I know, a radical thought process, and it's probably pretty distant in the future, but we can start talking about not having internal maintenance departments for a large portion of the equipment. Now you can start talking about outsourcing that maintenance to the service provider. So much better planned maintenance, of course, is much better than unplanned. So the black now, so that was the end user perspective. The black now is the OEM's perspective, the machine manufacturer's perspective. So currently they don't service their own machines typically, very rarely, because it's problematic in the sense that when the equipment is down, there is a lot of, shall I say, management attention. You know, a lot of people very excited, urgent calls, salespeople get involved, management gets involved. It's also very risky margin because not all the equipment plans and fails in a nice even pattern. You may get, particularly if your equipment is used seasonally, you're going to wind up with times when the people are the service people are very, very busy, other times when they're sitting on their hands, and typically low revenue. This study recently published in Harvard Business Review, I think something like 15% of a typical machine manufacturer's revenue is aftermarket, and that's all spare parts, nearly all spare parts, all right? Now, if we go to the IoT viewpoint, now, because you're conditioning monitoring, now you can plan the service. Now it becomes very manageable. It can be high margin because you can even out the workload, and it's high revenue growth. Now, you know, the people who have this kind of business model are a lot of the ERP suppliers, and when you look at their annual reports, it's not unusual that, in fact, it's pretty typical that 50%, sometimes 60% of their revenue comes from servicing their, you know, the annual contracts for maintenance and support. So we're talking about now that maintenance and support contract becoming part of the machine manufacturer's revenue model, business model, and a huge revenue growth opportunity. We're talking about potentially increasing revenue 50, 60%. So the ARC prediction is that IoT, because of the very strong business benefits from both an end user and a thought-leading OEM, there is a huge opportunity among OEMs to improve their revenue margin, for end users to have better utilization of their resources by outsourcing some of the maintenance to someone who, quite frankly, can do it better. The semiconductor industry, you know, has their own unusual, you know, they have several $100 million pieces of equipment that are very, very, very complex. They're already on this business model because there's no way in heck you could train somebody enough to service that kind of equipment. They're already there. And I can imagine that different industries will adapt this model in different ways going forward. But it's, we predict early adoption by the OEMs for the good use for the Internet of Things, and adoption that for business process and improvement and better margin and revenue and all that kind of stuff, better cost control, higher uptime, et cetera. All right, so this is what they call in the industry a teaser. This afternoon, the next session, which starts at 4 o'clock in this very room, I'm going to be talking about the same slide, but from the perspective of inventory management, spare parts management, and the supply chain.